There is a sociological phenomenon called Godwin's Law, which says that when an online discussion goes on long enough, someone is guaranteed to bring up Adolf Hitler, and it has never been more true than the comments of our videos. That's right, the time has come for us to finally talk about the biggest Nazi of them all, Adolf Hitler. Now, most of us have learned about World War II and the Holocaust in history class, but very few people know about Adolf Hitler's personal life. His early years and his rise to power show us how one man used fear and anger of the German people to manipulate other human beings. He transformed a nation into a force of hate and destruction that was responsible for the deaths of millions of people. And today on Biographics, we bring you the infamous life of Adolf Hitler. Today's story begins even before Hitler's birth. His father, Alois, was an illegitimate child of a 42-year-old peasant named Maria Anna Schicklgruber. She had never been married and supported herself by working as a housekeeper for wealthy Jewish families in Austria. Maria left the name of Alois's father blank on his baptism certificate, so no one has any way of knowing who Hitler's biological grandfather actually is. A few years later, Maria married a man named Johann Georg Heidler, so both she and Alois both took on his last name. But when the priest wrote their marriage certificate, he spelled their last name Hitler instead. This name means the one who lives in a hut. It's not exactly the most flattering last name, but for some reason they decided to keep it. Maria died at the age of 51 when Alois was just 10 years old. He went on to live in his stepfather's family farm, where he worked hard to earn his keep. As a teenager, he apprenticed under a cobbler and learned the art of leather making. He was ambitious, so he got a job with the Austrian Ministry of Finance, and this put him firmly in the middle class. Alois Hitler got married and divorced twice before marrying his third wife, Clara Pulsel. They had 2 children who died in infancy before finally giving birth to a healthy son on April the 20th, 1889. They named him Adolphus Hitler. They went on to have another son, Edmund, in 1894. Adolf Hitler was rebellious and lazy from a very young age, and he did not get good grades. His father was an angry man, and he would beat Adolf frequently when he misbehaved. His mother, in contrast, was very protective and would show him unconditional love no matter how badly he behaved. At 8 years old, he began singing in his church choir, and his mother fawned over him, telling him that he was the most talented boy in the church. She believed in him so much that she paid for him to have private voice lessons. He told his parents that he wanted to be a Catholic priest, and he was already preaching to other children. Up until this point, there was a small sliver of hope that maybe Hitler could have turned out to be a normal person, but in the year 1900, his younger brother, Edmund, he died of the measles. The graveyard where Edmund was buried just so happened to be across the street from their house, so he was never able to properly mourn and move on with his life. Adolf Hitler was only 11 years old at that time, and he became incredibly depressed. The boy spent a lot of time hanging out in the graveyard, lying next to his brother's grave late into the night. He would talk out loud to his dead brother, and he'd stare at the stars. According to Hitler, he was afraid of his father, and he only loved his mother. Alois could probably see that his son desperately needed discipline and structure in his life, but Clara was always there to swoop in and baby him. Unfortunately, Alois did not live long enough to make sure that Adolf learned to take responsibility for himself. Alois Hitler died in 1903 when Adolf was 14 years old. Clara didn't protest when Adolf decided to drop out of high school at the age of 16. Instead of pushing him to actually do something with his life, his mother allowed him to become a NEET, which is someone who is not participating in education, employment, or training. As we mentioned earlier, the family was middle class. They certainly weren't wealthy, and now that his father had passed away, his mother was on a strict budget. For young Adolf, he'd like to walk around town wearing fancy clothes and carrying a cane, pretending to be an independently wealthy man. He never worked a day in his life, and his mother had built up his ego so much that he truly believed that he deserved to get everything simply handed to him just because he existed. Whenever people in town asked what young Adolf Hitler planned to do with his life, he declared that he would be the greatest artist in the world. Hitler applied to be in the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, Austria, but he was rejected. He wrote, "I was so convinced that I would be successful that when I received my rejection, it struck me as a bolt from the blue." The paintings that have been attributed to Hitler are nothing special, even after years of practice. It's clear that he had certain delusions of grandeur. Clara Hitler died in 1907 from breast cancer when Adolf was 18 years old. He was crushed because he loved his mother more than anyone in the world. Now that both of his parents were dead, you'd think that he'd maybe, get a job, but no, he still had this baffling sense of entitlement, and he believed that he shouldn't have to work because he still believed he could be Europe's greatest artist. Hitler moved to Vienna, and he lived like a king off the inheritance that his parents had left behind. Alois Hitler, he worked his entire life to save up that money for retirement, and Adolf spent all of it in a single year. After this, he was so broke that he ended up having to live in homeless shelters. Desperate for income, Hitler wrote to family and friends, asking them to support his life as an artist. Considering that the majority of his relatives were in the working class, the replies were not very surprising. They told him to get a job. However, he did convince at least one aunt to start sending him money for his basic needs. After years of practicing on a daily basis, he finally started making a small income by selling watercolor paintings to local businesses and tourists, but he would never be able to support himself fully from his art. In 1913, Hitler moved to Munich, Germany, and continued to paint and sell his watercolors. When World War I began, there was a new sense of enthusiasm in German pride. His career as a painter, it clearly wasn't going anywhere, so he joined the German army. Once he was in the military, he thrived after having some discipline and structure put into his life. He still had a lot of confidence in himself, no matter what he did, and this helped him rise through the ranks until he became a corporal. He believed that Germany should have won the war, and he blamed Jewish propaganda as the reason why they didn't win. When the war was over in 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II was forced to step down from his throne. Germany created a new government called the Weimar Republic, and they signed the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. In Article 231 of the treaty, it states, "The Allied and associated governments affirm and Germany accepts the responsibility for causing all of the loss and damage as a consequence of the war imposed upon them by the aggression of Germany and her allies." They were forced to pay money to all of the countries for all of the damage that they had caused, as well as give up 13% of their land. Following the war, the Weimar Republic had struggled to deal with the crippling debt from the Treaty of Versailles. This new government, it tried to create jobs through public works projects, but the country, it simply couldn't afford to pay for them. So instead of taking responsibility for their problems and trying to come up with a solution that made sense, they tried to take the easy way out and just print more money. Now look, even if you just have a basic knowledge about how economics works, printing excess money means there is more currency in circulation, and therefore its overall value goes down. The people in charge, they had absolutely no idea what they were doing, and between 1921 and 1923, they went through a period of hyperinflation, where the value of just a single US dollar was equal to several trillion German marks. Money was so worthless that kids were using stacks of money as building blocks, and they cut it up to make kites. Whenever someone wanted to buy something at the store, they'd have to take a wheelbarrow full of cash with them. So at this point, Adolf Hitler had secured a job working for the German army as a confidential informant. This was basically someone who spied on average citizens to make sure that they weren't getting into any trouble. Then in 1919, he attended a meeting of the German Workers' Party at a beer hall. Even though he was sent as a spy, he realized that he actually rather agreed with everything the Workers' Party was saying. They blamed the Jews for all of the country's problems, and they wanted Germany to go back to the glorious land it once was. This organization was the precursor to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or, you probably guessed it, the Nazis. Adolf Hitler decided to join this party. He was good at public speaking, so he was able to encourage new members to join up too. As the years went on, he began to rise in the ranks of the Nazi leadership, and by November the 8th, 1923, Hitler led over 2,000 members of the Nazi Party to the center of Munich, and they attempted to overthrow the German government. This became known as the Beer Hall Putsch. Hitler and many of the other protesters, they were arrested for treason. While he was in jail, Hitler began to write about his life and his ideas. He was supposed to be in prison for 5 years, but he only served 9 months, and he was released in 1925. When he was free, he published his autobiography called Mein Kampf, which means My Struggle. The book became a bestseller, and Hitler became a millionaire from the sales revenue. The book continued to sell so well that he made $1 million every year, which is the equivalent of over $14 million in today's money. The German people felt that the Weimar Republic was a total failure because the members of the government were incompetent. Many people could tell that it was only a matter of time before there was another revolution. Thousands of people, they joined either the Communist Party or the Nazis. But the wealthy business owners in Germany, they did not want the communists to take over because capitalism would have been destroyed. So the upper class began to financially support the Nazi Party. These donations, along with Hitler's new windfall of money, helped make the Nazi Party bigger and better. In a world where there was so much poverty, the Nazis seemed to be prospering, and many people began to believe that it was truly the best option. In the 1920s and 30s, investigative journalists began to dig into Adolf Hitler's past. He was becoming more of a public figure, and people wanted to know more about him. Several magazines published a theory that Hitler's mysterious biological grandfather was actually Jewish. Of course, Hitler claims that this was all fake news propagated by the Jews, and that he was actually a pure-blooded Aryan German. This is despite the fact that his dark hair and eyes are far from the blonde-haired, blue-eyed ideal that he loved quite so much. The Nazis' governor of Poland, Hans Frank, wrote that he uncovered evidence that Hitler's grandmother, Maria Schicklgruber, received child support payments from a Jewish man named Leopold Frankenberger. The young man was just 19 when he got 42-year-old Maria pregnant, and he did not want to marry her after their affair. In 2010, a DNA test confirms that Hitler did, in fact, have Jewish and even African ancestry. It was clear that the German people, they were angry, and plenty of people were trying to come up with peaceful solutions to retaining a democratic government. In 1924, a man named Charles G. Dawes came up with a plan to borrow money from American banks, and then use these loans to pay for the coal industry. Germany would sell coal to France, and it would help pay down their debt. This was called Dawes's Plan, and for a while, it was actually working. For the first time in years, Germany had hope of recovery. In 1925, Charles Dawes was given the Nobel Peace Prize. But in 1929, the United States stock market crashed spectacularly, and Germany could no longer rely on those American loans. This marked the beginning of the Great Depression. The Weimar Republic's constitution contained a clause called Article 48, which gave the president power to enforce any law. In 1930, President Paul von Hindenburg began to use Article 48 to create new laws in a desperate attempt to fix the nation's economy. There was a tremendous amount of civil unrest, and the Nazi Party was growing larger and more powerful every single day. President Hindenburg could see that the Nazis posed a threat to the Weimar Republic, so he decided that the only way to maintain democracy in Germany was for the parties to work together. He appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany in 1933. Just 4 weeks later, on February the 27th, 1933, the Reichstag Parliament building was set on fire. Hitler claimed that the communists did this, and he convinced President Hindenburg to create laws that banned freedom of the press and peaceful protest. Of course, this was just a ploy to get rid of the Communist Party from Germany, and many people believed that the Nazis were actually behind the arson. In the summer of 1934, Hitler and his devout followers, Heinrich Himmler and Hermann Göring, began the Night of the Long Knives. They staged a major coup by murdering the most powerful members of the Weimar Republic. Hitler began to ban all of the trade unions and made all other political parties illegal. The only choice a German citizen had anymore was to simply be a Nazi. This was his Third Reich, which was an empire that was apparently going to last 1,000 years. Hitler gave speeches that were full of hyperbole. He claimed that everything was the greatest and made outlandish promises about the future of Nazi Germany. A lot of people, they look back in history and they wonder how the German people could have let this happen. How could they have been so foolish as to give so much power to one mad man? But put yourself in the Germans' shoes for just a second. You're at rock bottom. You've got absolutely no hope of feeding your family or finding any meaning in your life and your career. Suddenly, a man with confidence comes along and he convinces you that you're special. You're a part of this magical master race, and he knows exactly who to blame for all of your problems and how to make it better. The Germans, they fell for it, hook, line, and sinker.